Hello and welcome back everybody to our summary videos on the book White Fragility. So we just finished week 4, which is our final week in the book study, as we looked at the final 4 chapters, 9 through 12. To get us started, we're going to look at chapter 9, and Doug is going to share his take on our scripture reading that is our focus for this entire series, which comes from Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 to 5, where Jesus is talking about taking that plank out of your own eye before looking at the plank in others. And it ties in really well with chapter 9, which is entitled White Fragility in Action. And I'd like to share a quote with you real quick from there, page 117. White people are receptive to my presentation as long as it remains abstract. The moment I name some racially problematic dynamic or action happening in the room in the moment, white fragility erupts. One of the things we learn in the book from the author is that she's done these presentations and seminars around the world helping people recognize racial inequality. And white people in general are okay talking about it as long as it doesn't deal with us, as long as it doesn't require us to take the plank out of our own eye. So here's Doug to open that up a little bit more for us.
What if Jesus is saying it this way purposefully? Because he understands that we live in a culture that is based on judging. He knows that we consciously and subconsciously judge, and that we often do it incorrectly. So what do you mean, Doug? We sometimes give value as well as non-value to people based on our judgments. We often associate worth with certain cultural ideas. Sometimes human worth or human value is assigned by race, by social and economic status, by gender, and by who we love. I suggest that Jesus understands that it requires great effort to have clear vision of the kingdom of God, a vision in which all people are loved and accepted by Christ. Maybe he uses this troubling imagery of sawdust and boards stuck in our eyes to remind us that we are not exempt from judging incorrectly, and that we should first attempt to remove the obstacles from our eyes so that we can clearly see our brothers and sisters as God sees them. Amen. A lot stood out to me, but I wanted to sort of have a single focus today. And so let me start with the question, and it's at the bottom sort of underlined, and it says, have you ever made white fragility claims yourself? I don't want you to answer that now. We'll do that in the group. But so as I was looking at it, I wanted to sort of relate this question to feelings, behaviors, and claims. And so if you look at sort of the grid on the far left, my far left, so some of the feelings when particularly white people are discussing race, some of the things that may arise are the feeling of being singled out, insulted, attacked, judged, silenced, anger, shame, scared, guilty, and outraged. There's many more, but I just wanted to get you sort of think about those things, and maybe you've experienced some of those in the course of this study. Some of the behaviors, which, to be honest, I haven't seen these. I haven't seen crying or denying or any of those. Physical leaving, focusing on attention, or arguing. Well, some of that, but that's healthy, I think. Avoiding, emotionally withdrawn, or seeking absolution. And then the final point I want to make up is some of the claims that comes up in this type of work and discussion about white fragility is, I know people of color. I marched in the 60s, and I think we've covered those in previous topics before. I already know this. I already know all of this. You are judging me. You don't know me. And that is just your opinion. So I guess the point of this is really just to think about the claims and how these are all sort of interlinked together.
Now, as we transition into chapter 10, we see a chapter entitled White Fragility and the Rules of Engagement. And it doesn't give us practical tips and rules for engagement, but instead it highlights some of the undertones that we as white people use when discussing racism, and some of the generalized rules of engagement that we've created to help us avoid actual engagement and discussion on racism.
And then chapter 10, I don't know about you, but when I read it, I thought it was very interesting. White fragility and the rules of engagement. Who knew there was a rule of engagement? But some of the things I highlight, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some of the ones I picked out for the sake of time, is do I give feedback on my racism under any circumstances? Right? And then sort of like the subtopic of that is that if you insist on breaking number one, the cardinal rule, then you must follow the other rules. There must be trust between us. You must trust that I am in no way racist before you can give me feedback on my racism. And then the other ones, feedback must be given immediately. And I won't read the other ones because I think this will be brought up during the discussions in a little small class. And that was my attempt, just to bring some of the readings from chapter 10 and chapter 9 into our focus.
Now, to better help us understand chapter 11, Pastor Jane is going to introduce it and discuss it through the lens of the tragic story of Emmett Till and a current event story that happened just recently. Chapter 11 is entitled White Women's Tears. And on page 135, the author notes, "We need to reflect on when we cry and when we don't, and why. In other words, what does it take to move us?" In this chapter, it'll help us see, it'll open up our eyes to the realities of the historical impact of white women's tears and racial injustice.
You'll see these pictures. You probably know on this, what's going on in this one? Does anybody know?
That's the lady that called. She was in the park in New York City calling, saying, reporting the black guy there, saying he was harassing her, or was whatever, called the police on him.
Yeah, because he wanted her to put a leash on her dog. Right, so it's crazy, isn't it, that she's calling the cops. I'm going to call the cops. I've got a black man here and he's harassing me and I'm in the middle of the woods unattended. Can you please get a policeman? So he's taping this and we're watching this, and this is that kind of Karen behavior that has been talked about a lot. And we're like, that's crazy. Where does that come from? Well, you know what? There's a long history in African-American experience of women that claim that black men caused them distress, and it leads to a lot worse than what happened with Christian Cooper, who decided not to press charges or get involved. Here is the picture of Emmett Till. You perhaps have heard the name of that man before. He was 14 years old. He went to visit some relatives in some town in Alabama or whatever, and he was talking to this white woman, or allegedly talking to a white woman, and she claimed that he grabbed her and was doing all sorts of things, was doing some terrible things to her. So then the next day, her husband and a lynch mob came and took this boy and beat him up and mutilated him and killed him. And a white jury found that these men that did it not guilty. And then she later claimed that, admitted that nothing had ever happened. And this is kind of the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And this is the kind of story that has lived in African-American culture for a long time, and back in the plantation days, when white landowner, the plantation women, would claim that the men had raped them, and the men then would get brutalized, whereas the white men would oftentimes rape the black women and bear all sorts of children, and nothing would happen. And so it's really like she just says, if you're in an experience where your racism is getting called out and you start crying, do it, leave the room. Do not spend time in front of people of color crying about what's going on with you. Now, and don't take offense that you're being asked to do this. Now, with men's response is oftentimes much more caustic and angry. But in either case, like, be respectful of the fact that your responses are pushing buttons for Black people in their history. And it's the same thing as when you go to a culture and you learn, like, waving in certain cultures is considered offensive. So you know better not to wave. And white people need to start becoming much more sensitive about their behavior to some of this stuff if they want to truly find solidarity with the Black community. So that is, in a nutshell, the chapter 11.
In our final chapter, chapter 12, Jane is going to help explain where do we go from here. And there's a great quote on page 144 that says, "When white people ask me what to do about racism and white fragility, the first thing I ask is, what has enabled you to be a full, educated, professional adult and not know what to do about racism?" As we've learned from the author, many of us are looking for simple solutions and directions and a clear path forward. And one of the lessons I've learned from this book is that it might not be that clear cut, and that removing the plank from our own eye takes time and energy and effort, and it takes vulnerability, because we're gonna make mistakes along the way. So I'd like to end my thoughts with a quote from Maya Angelou. She said, "Do the best you can until you know better, then do better." And that really needs to be our approach to learning about racism, because we're gonna make mistakes and it's gonna be uncomfortable, but it's up to us to own it and not be defensive, because it's up to us to grow. So thank you, everybody, and here's Pastor Jane with those final thoughts on chapter 12.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about chapter 12. So the question of what do we do differently? How are we possibly going to make a change now that we've kind of learned about what our tendencies, what our behaviors are, our misbehaviors, our mistakes, all that sort of thing? Well, she suggests that we adapt what she calls an anti-racist framework. And this is looking at our behavior through the anti-racist lens. And that's what she invites us to do as white people, come to this work from a different perspective. Instead of those defensive feelings that Doug had brought out, that are the rules of engagement for white people generally before Enlightenment, instead, when someone's giving you feedback about your racist behavior, have gratitude, have excitement. You're going to learn something. Because we have these feelings instead of the previous feelings, we're going to want to engage in the following behaviors. We're going to want to reflect on what we just did instead of just getting defensive. We're going to look to apologize. We're going to listen. We're going to process. We're going to seek more understanding. We're going to grapple with what just happened. We're going to get engaged instead of withdrawing. And we're going to believe what somebody tells us instead of saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. What response might we have? And these are the things that we can say, I appreciate this feedback. It's my responsibility to resist defensiveness and complacency. Oops. I will focus on the message and not the messenger. So even if it's not a friend who's telling us this information, if it's somebody that we're even a little bit intimidated by, we're still going to listen and appreciate the information instead of withdrawing. We're going to say it's very helpful. We're going to admit it's hard, but it's stimulating and important. It's personal, but not strictly personal. I mean, I'm hurt or this is going on, but I know whatever's going on with me, it's not just about me. I'm a representative of a larger group. So it's important that I publicly process what's going on and to acknowledge that I have some work to do. And the transformation. So we're getting the transformed things again. So this is the different approach that she suggests that we take. And we just decide that we're going to put on this lens and move ahead in that direction. And she ends the book really talking about this concept of interrupting racism. That's really our main job. Like when we hear something, when we experience something that clearly is that white people are saying because they can, and they may not even realize what they're saying. Our job is to interrupt it. No matter how uncomfortable that might make us feel, no matter what mistakes we might make, and no matter whose feelings we might hurt.
Thank you again, everybody, for participating in this series and reading the book. Please don't forget to thumbs up and like the video. And you can also follow our channels on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube to make sure you're always up to date with the most current content. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.